there, it's Crystal here from Speaking of Wildlife, and we are so excited to be joining you for Aurora's Canada Day celebrations. Today, we are going to take you on a small tour of our wildlife center, where we house not only species that you can find here in the province of Ontario, but also animals that have been deemed non-releasable. This means that these animals are injured, orphaned, abandoned, or were illegally kept as pets and could not be released to the wild where they belong. So come along with us as we tour our wildlife center, learn a little more about some of Canada's wildlife, and have a little summer fun. First up, we're going to be talking about Rocket, the raccoon. Now, Rocket came to us when he was only a few weeks old because unfortunately he was found without his mom or his family, and he was too young to be on his own. Now, the people that found him did everything they could to reunite with his mom, then to get him into a wildlife rehabilitation center, but unfortunately, none of these things really worked out for Rocket. And so he was looking for a permanent home that could take care of him and give him a fairly natural place to live and grow up and keep him safe and healthy as well. Now, when he first came to us, he was only about 5 weeks old. He's now 3 years old, and he could live up to 20 years in captivity with us. Now, the wild versions of Rocket, the wild raccoons maybe that you see in your neighborhood, face some different challenges, and they might not live 20 years out there. Usually it's 10 or less even. Now, out in the wild, you're probably thinking, I see raccoons all the time because they get into things like garbages and gardens and things around where we live. But truthfully, out in the wild where these guys are living naturally, they should be near water. They should be near things like wetlands or lakes or rivers, shorelines where they can find some of their favorite foods, like bugs and plants and fish that live in the water, crayfish sometimes too. And when they're doing this, they're going to use some of their senses. Now, when we think about our senses, we have hearing and vision, smell, taste, touch. Raccoons have all of that too, but some of their senses are a bit stronger or better developed than ours. So they might smell something yummy, but they're going to use their hands mostly to find it, maybe even rip it apart, tear off a shell or a hard outer layer, and then eat it. So they're going to use their sense of touch more than some of those other senses when they're hunting. Now, one of the things that we sometimes hear is that raccoons, being in those natural spaces near water, also take their food back to the water to wash it off. Now, we think this is kind of funny because in urban areas or in places where you and I live, you don't see too many raccoons stealing things out of our gardens or garbages and walking them back down to the water to wash them off before they eat them. So it's not necessarily that a raccoon is a neat freak or a germaphobe, but it's rather that they need to use the water to enhance their sense of touch even more. So they're going to stick their hands under the water and feel things even better than they already do. It also helps them because when they're hunting near the water and they have their hands under there looking for food, they can actually keep their eyes and their ears up. And that allows them to look maybe above them for things that might be flying overhead and might be dangerous, allows them to listen and look for things that might want to eat them. So it's important to them to have that amazing sense of touch in order to stay safe while they're hunting. Now, Rocket has done an excellent job with us today, so I think we'll move on to another kind of animal and let Rocket get back to his fun in the sun. Next up, we're going to talk about the beaver, because what's more Canadian than a beaver? They're nature's engineer and well adapted to living in aquatic habitats. In fact, they have a toolbox built right onto their bodies. They have things like built-in earplugs, nose plugs, an extra eyelid that kind of acts like goggles. They even have fur-lined lips, so they can carry sticks or logs through the water without swallowing any. Now, we can't really talk about beavers without talking about some of those other iconic features, like their great big teeth. They keep growing their entire lives. And they're ironclad. They're actually covered in an iron enamel so that they can chew through logs and trees, make their homes, which are called lodges, and dams to make a beautiful habitat or a beaver meadow to live in. They also have those great big webbed feet that act like flippers and help them to get through the water really quickly. And of course, that beaver tail. And I'm not talking about the dessert that we get at fairs. The beaver tail on an actual beaver serves a much different purpose than the ones we get at those fairs. These beaver tails are actually amazing rudders when they're swimming through the water. They help to steer the beaver along. They can also help them when they're gnawing on a tree or a branch. Things are taking a little longer than expected. They can stick that beaver tail out behind them, and it's kind of like a tripod or maybe a lazy boy. They kind of lean back and take a break. And of course, many of us have heard that beaver's tail smack on the water, whether we're out kayaking or canoeing or just on shore near beaver habitat. If we startle them, they will smack that tail on the water as a warning, not only to let you know that they know you're around, but also to let other beavers know to head home. Now, the lodges that they have that they've built are accessible only by water. So normally, if a beaver slaps its tail, it's down deep underwater, heading straight home to a tunnel that leads up into that lodge. That is the easiest way for a beaver to stay safe. Our beaver here, her name is Carrie, and Carrie lives with her companion Sammy, and both of these beavers are here for kind of a strange reason. They were flood victims. So they were actually swept away from their lodges and from their home habitats or environments when they were just babies. So too young to be on their own, and certainly too young to find their way back to their homes. So they were brought to a wildlife rehabilitation center, but because there was no point of origin, because we didn't know where exactly these beavers had been swept away from, they weren't able to be reintroduced or released back to the wild. So unfortunately, Sammy and Carrie aren't able to live a wild life, but they will live here at our wildlife center, where we give them all kinds of natural features, like this big beautiful pond. And we started their lodge, but they finished it. They're much better builders than we are. All right, so we've met Canada's icon. Let's move on to another animal here at the center. Next up, we've got Dior, the striped skunk. Dior actually came to us because he was orphaned or abandoned as a baby, and unfortunately, while in wildlife rehabilitation, he didn't really act much like a skunk. He wasn't afraid of people, and he got a little too used to the yummy treats that they brought along as well. So Dior was deemed non-releasable because he just doesn't have the skills to survive in the wild. Now, he is a striped skunk, so you can see that Dior here has two beautiful stripes down his back. But not all striped skunks have two stripes. Some, like our skunk Chanel, only have one stripe. Others might have as many as three, and as my grandmother learned sort of the hard way, some skunks don't have any stripes at all. They're completely black, except for a little bit of white on their nose. Now, she learned this because she thought that black skunk was a cat, and she actually approached it. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, whoa, that could have gone really badly, because we all know that skunks have a bit of a reputation for being kind of stinky. It's how they protect themselves. But you don't really have to worry if you encounter a skunk out in the wild, because they can smell way better than we can. So they don't really like the smell of themselves. And if ever they feel threatened enough to spray, they'll actually give you a few warning signs leading up to it before they actually use the stinker. They might growl or stomp their feet, stick up their tails. They will warn you in many ways before they turn around and shoot you with that stinky spray. Now, if you do get sprayed, they're going to do it well. They have amazing muscles back here that can actually direct and control their spray. It could be a jet stream or a mist, depending on their targets. And once you get sprayed with that stinky stuff, you're stuck with it. We've heard some pretty creative ways of how to get rid of that skunk spray or that smell, including tomato juice, but none of them really work. The best thing that we've heard, tried and true, is a combination of hydrogen peroxide, baking soda, and dish soap. Those three things help to get through the oil that spray is made of, and also help with the smell. Now, that said, you might have to rinse and repeat. And if you live with the dog that's been sprayed, or if you were sprayed yourself, well, you might want to take a day off. Because even when you can no longer smell it, I can guarantee you that your friends probably still can. Now, Dior is munching on an egg right now. Skunk is an omnivore, and they're pretty opportunistic. So they'll eat just about anything that they can find. They'll eat seeds and nuts and berries, plants, insects. They love to dig up in our grass and our dirt in our yards for bugs and grubs. And they'll also eat small animals, like mice maybe. So they eat a little bit of everything. And in captivity, we try to give Dior a balanced diet of all of those things, a special skunk food, and we give him enrichment. So over here, we've got some dirt in a bowl. He was digging around in that, looking for the worms that are hidden inside. Again, eliciting that natural behavior. He's got an egg, and he has this toy. This toy has holes in it. He moves it around, and that helps him to get the kibble or the treats that are inside. So we make sure that we give Dior as varied a diet as possible and lots of things to keep him busy and entertained. But I think that we're going to leave Dior to finish his egg and move on to our next guest. All right, next up we've got Maverick the wolf. Some of you may recall meeting him at past in-person or virtual events. Today, we're going to chat a little bit about Maverick and the reason that he's so comfortable around people. Wolves normally live in a pack. So normally they would have lots of family members, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and of course their parents to work together to find food and do all of the things they would need to do to survive. But in Maverick's case, his pack in captivity wasn't really working together the way they should. And it put the pups' lives at risk, or it put the pups in danger. So Maverick was transferred to us when he was still just a baby. He was only about 10 days old. And he was raised by myself and some of our staff. So he actually sort of thinks that I'm his mom, or his alpha female, sort of the boss of our pack. And he thinks that some of the other humans around here are other members of the pack. So for that reason, Maverick is pretty comfortable with us. And he does some pretty silly things. Sometimes we feed him, and if there's a little extra to spare, he'll bring it back to us. We don't really have the heart to tell him that we prefer our meat cooked, or that we prefer not to chomp through bones and feathers and fur like he does. Now, another thing that Maverick does, because he thinks that we're all part of the same pack, is communicate with us. You might be thinking, I know how wolves communicate. They howl. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. So wolves howl to talk to one another. And we thought today we might be able to do a quick hello and maybe Happy Canada Day to Maverick. At least that's what I'm going to try to say. And we'll see if Maverick howls back with me. If you'd like to try this at home, you're welcome to howl along. And if you've got pets in the room, watch them to see how they react to the wolf suddenly howling in their living room. You guys ready? We're going to howl. 1, 2, 3. Oh! Maybe I told him to walk away. Let's try that again. Oh! Oh, happy Canada Day, Mav. Let's move on to our next guest. This is Mimic, and Mimic is a fox snake. Now, fox snakes are the second longest species of snake that you can find here in the province of Ontario. They can grow to be over 6 feet long. Now, this snake is living in places like grasslands and wetlands where they can find some of their favorite foods like mice, frogs, and other amphibians or rodents. Now, when they are looking for their food, they're doing it in pretty unique ways. Unlike us, who have ears on the side of our head that stick out and act kind of like funnels to catch all kinds of sounds and noises and voices, snakes don't have external ears. So they actually hear or feel movement or vibrations in a bit of a different way. They will feel the vibrations from the sound or from footsteps or movement, and that will indicate to them whether the animal or the thing making those sounds is big or small enough to eat. So if it's something like us, they might think, oh my goodness, that's way too big and pretty scary. I've got to get out of here. But if it's something smaller, like a mouse or a frog hopping by, they'll get closer to investigate. Now they're going to use another sense to investigate further. They're going to use their sense of smell. But again, it's a little different than ours. So we have one nose with one set of nostrils that help us to breathe and to smell. But snakes have sort of two different noses. One on the front of their face for breathing, and a special nose called their Jacobson's organ for smelling. Now, that Jacobson's organ doesn't do all the smelling on its own. It requires the help of a snake's tongue. So if you guys want to try smelling like a snake does, stick your tongue out as far as you can, and then stick your tongue up your nose. That's kind of how it works for a snake. They stick out their tongue and they gather all kinds of smells from the environment. Then they bring that tongue back inside their mouth and they stick it up their Jacobson's organ, which is located on the roof of their mouth. So while we look pretty silly trying to stick our tongues up our noses, snakes don't look that silly at all. Now, once they've smelled it and they know it's something that they might like to eat, they're going to get closer and start looking for it. But snakes can't see very well from far away. So once they're close enough to see it, they'll reach out, grab onto it with their mouths, wrap their bodies around it, and squeeze it. And when it stops moving, fox snakes, like Mimic, will actually swallow their food whole in one big piece. Now, since they're swallowing their food whole, it takes a little bit of work. Their mouth stretches wide, they have to stretch their bodies as that food moves down into their bellies, and then they have to take a bit of a rest while that food digests and breaks down in their bellies. So snakes, like Mimic, would only eat once every maybe 3 to 5 days in the wild, depending on the size of their meal, and in captivity, like at Speaking of Wildlife, Mimic eats once a week. Because we know for sure he's getting a good hearty meal every week. Now, maybe one more note about Mimic. For anyone out there thinking, ew, snakes are slimy, I want you to rest assured that snakes aren't actually slimy at all. In fact, if we had to compare me to Mimic, I'm slimier than he is. Because humans have sweat and oil in our skin, and that makes us kind of slimy. At least compared to snakes who don't have either of those things. So snakes are definitely not slimy.
Mimic has done an excellent job today, but now I think it's time to move on.
This is Nile, and Nile is a barred owl. Now, like all birds of prey, he has all the tools he needs built right onto his body to be able to hunt, chase, catch, and eat other animals for his food. So if we sort of start at the top of Nile's head and move our way down, we can talk about a few of his tools. The first and most obvious are those great big eyes. Now, they're well adapted to seeing in low light, so he can hunt pretty well at nighttime. Now you can see he's also moving his head around, trying to sort of locate some of the sources of the sounds around us today. He has to move his head like that because he can't move his eyes. You and I can actually do a bit of an experiment to sort of show how this works. If you and I were looking straight ahead and we didn't move our heads or our bodies at all, we could shift our eyes from side to side, up and around. We have muscles behind our eyes that allow us to do that. But because Nile's eyes are so big inside his head, he can't. If you guys want to see like Nile sees, you can put on your owl goggles. So make 2 circles with your hands, just like this, but with both hands for you guys, and bring them up to your eyes. Now you've got your owl goggles on. So if you wanted to look at something next to you, could you just shift your eyes? No, you would see just your hands or just those tunnels. So you would actually have to move your head. Now we can turn our heads about a quarter of the way around. You can try that. Nile here can go 3 times as far as you and I can. So he could turn his head that way to start. He did it right on cue there. He could keep going over his back, keep turning until he faced me, but then he'd have to go back the way he came before he turned his head this way. He's doing a pretty good job of demonstrating. So he can turn his head much further than we can, and that's all to help with that vision. Now, that's not the first thing that he's actually going to use when he's hunting. Might be the most noticeable, but his best sense is actually hidden under all of the feathers along his facial disc. He has ears hidden in there. So they don't stick out like ours, but he doesn't need them to, because his face being flat and round like that is sort of like a big funnel that collects all the sounds that come towards him and sends them to the ear that the sound is closest to. That's what lets him know that he should turn his head and then see or look for the food or the thing that might be making that noise. So once he's heard it and he's seen it, he's decided he wants to eat it. So he's going to swoop down out of the tree that he's resting in and use silent flight. He doesn't make any noise at all when he's flapping or when he's flying. And at the very last minute, he's going to stick out his catching gear or his landing gear, these great big feet. He's going to stick out those talons, those feet, grab hold of his food, and often carry it up into a tree to enjoy it. But how does he rip it apart? How does he chew it? With his beak. You don't see many owls using forks and knives and things like we use at our dinner tables. They have them all, like I mentioned, built right onto their bodies. How cool is that?
Well, guys, that brings us to the end of our little tour here at Speaking of Wildlife. We do hope that you enjoyed meeting a few of our wildlife ambassadors and some of Canada's wild animals. And the next time that you see a wild animal in your backyard or around a place that you visit, we hope that you'll take the time to admire and observe them from afar, to learn a little bit more about them, and of course, to respect them. Many of these wild animals were here even before we were. So thanks again, guys, and until next time, take care.